nationalism that rejects the entire history of the post-70 Jewish diaspora for an idealist vision of ancient Eastern Hebrew purity. In and of themselves, both of these ideas are quite common to early Hebrew culture. Indeed, they represent two distinct poles to which much of Zionist cultural thought as a whole gravitated. However, what's interesting, what I find key to talking about Idelsohn, is the way in which they come together in the mind of one person, and the way they not only interplay but influence one another as two poles that kind of meld together into Idelsohn's conception of Hebrew music. Now, as you probably know, Idelsohn's story is one of initially radically rejecting the Galut experience, and this begins with his name. Upon his arrival in Palestine, he changes it to Avram ben Zvi Yehuda in homage to Eliezer ben Yehuda, his friend, neighbor, mentor, colleague. He then quickly issued a series of public calls for the rejection of all diasporic Jewish music, Musica Yehudit. He even celebrates, in a very noted, controversial set of articles, Wagner's anti-Semitic depiction of Jewish musicians in the diaspora, which he contrasts with the new Hebrew national music born of Jewish repatriation to its homeland and racial roots. Based on its ancient Semitic Oriental roots, cleansed of the, quote, rust of the exile, Nigina Ivrit, Hebrew song, would be free of European influence, he wrote in 1907, without, quote, any of the melody, harmony, or theory of European song, HaTorah shel Nigina Europeit, and based on a new theory with its own principles of harmony, form, and scale, derived from, quote, its sounds which no other nations possess. Because of the dramatic, essentialist character of this model of Semitic Oriental music, and the many cultural and political ironies therein, scholars have emphasized how Idelsohn's Hebrew music fit neatly into a radical form of shlilat galut, the wholesale rejection of the diaspora, as opposed to a more accommodating, selective recalibration. Yet in spite of this, in spite of these polemics, what's often missed is that many of his early cultural activities in the Yishuv bespoke a far more nuanced view of Hebrew music as a product of diaspora in Zion, East and West. And here I want to turn briefly to Sefer HaShirim. Writing an introduction to this book in 1912, Idelsohn describes it as the first of its kind, intended to replace the existing songbooks full of German language songs with authentic Hebrew music. He even enacts his Zionist philosophy in music's graphical layout, making the unusual decision to publish the words and melodies from right to left, reversing the direction of standard Western musical notation. Yet if this ideological shift in the direction of the musical notation suggests a radical shlilat galut, it's complicated by the songbook's remarkably eclectic contents. While much of the musical material comes from Ashkenazi and Sephardi folk melody, a large number of the selections are from various Jewish composers, or Mechaberim Yehudim Shonim, including Yiddish song composers such as the Badchen, Eliyahu Zunzer, Mark Warshawski, and 19th century Reform composers such as Louis Lewandowski and Mombach. Even more ironic is the presence of Felix Mendelssohn, who Idelsohn himself had, just a matter of a few years before, referred to as an insane pagan who had, quote, disavowed his own people and converted. Not true, as we know. Mendelssohn didn't himself convert. As well as composers such as Schubert and Schumann. So the question obviously is, what are they doing in this anthology that is devoted to the purification of Hebrew song from its Germanic influences? One factor is undoubtedly the agenda of the book's sponsors, which was the Hilfsverein für Deutschen Juden, the liberal German Jewish philanthropic organization at the time. They were his employer. Idelsohn taught in one of their schools, and in a period of post-1907 practical Zionism, there was a rapprochement between the Hilfsverein and Alliance Israelite and local Zionists on a variety of educational and philanthropic projects. As Professor Saruski pointed out in his article also, the origins of the songbook also have to be understood in terms of the kind of dual mission of the Hilfsverein to create educational materials not only for the Yishuv, but also for Jewish communities back in Europe. But there's also a deeper philosophical reason behind what I call this early cosmopolitanism. For all of its goals of national self-definition in opposition to the European Jewish experience, Idelsohn retains a strong identification with a pan-European ideal of universal Western culture, of what he calls, in the introduction, the enlightened people, Amim HaNe'orim. Nationalist goals aside, the larger purpose of music education is, according to him, to create, quote, feelings of elegance, feelings of morality and beauty, feelings of everything that is exalted and holy to man. So the Zionists therefore need European music to educate the Jewish school children of Zion, even if the new Hebrew culture is supposedly predicated on creating a very fundamentally new kind of national identity that is not European. The project of Hebrew music building, therefore, not only tolerates Europeanness, it requires this as part of its aesthetic vision. What's interesting about this book is how Idelsohn justifies this notion that he's going to collect all of the music of the world that fits this definition of exaltedness and still preserve the Hebrew national mission. And what he does is make a claim that it's all dependent on not the melodies themselves, actually contradict himself, but on the semiotic value of the Hebrew language. The melodies and even texts might theoretically be German or Russian or Polish in their origins, but they became Jewish, in a positive Zionist sense, in Idelsohn's new Hebrew language versions. As he wrote at the time, the Hebrew language is enough to kasher and sanctify any impure song, to bring it into the national spirit and Judaize it. I would argue this also explains why he insisted on the right-to-left notation and the equally awkward practice of printing the text in Hebrew characters rather than romanization, even in the musical scores. The overall ideological elevation of the Hebrew language in his songbook was a neat compensatory strategy, a means of symbolically reconciling an ideal of nationalist self-definition with the acculturationist respect for European and European Jewish artistic achievement in the realm of music. Hebraicizing the language of European song was less a hypocritical compromise than a delicate balancing act of European and Jewish in a cosmopolitan nationalism, typical, after all, of much of Ben de Siècle Zionist creativity. In this way, Idelsohn's notion of Hebrew music created a philosophical license for other musicians in his day and afterwards to assert a staunchly nationalist Jewish cultural purity, even as they exhibited a remarkable stylistic eclecticism. However, this notion of Hebrew cosmopolitanism was not a perfect solution for him, because for any fusion of European and Hebrew, it still ran the risk of repeating the same errors of, quote, Judaization, according to his own logic of his manifestos at the time. And this is why he couples this Shiron of 1912 with all of his other ethnomusicological work, the search for the putatively ancient Eastern roots of Hebrew music in his other major project of the Thesaurus. For the sake of time, I'm going to restrict myself to a few general observations about the origin and meaning of the Thesaurus. As numerous scholars have noted, this project presents a classic exemplum of Hebrew music defined in a romantic nationalist fashion as a Jewish Oriental essentialism. The explicit goal is to reject European cultural contamination and to recover a pure, ancient Hebrew music. Rather than extol the power of Hebrew language to define this new music, here Idelsohn moves beyond language altogether as a linguistic line of demarcation between Jewish and non-Jewish in the realm of sound. The first volume's focus is hence naturally enough on the Yemenite Jews, which we'll hear from Noah Gerber in his talk in a few minutes, which Idelsohn perceives as the embodiment of an ancient Semitic sound and ironically linked to contemporary Arabic music. Of course, despite this form of shlilat hagalut, which seems to be on the surface, again, much more radical because it's moving way beyond Europeanness towards something pure, Eastern, ancient, Hebrew, etc. As many of us have noticed, this is a work which is fundamentally dependent in many ways on European scholarship, technology, and cultural assumptions in its form and content. Indeed, its very German title and publication history indicates the deep reliance on European imperialism in defining Hebrew culture. In a sense, then, if the songbook, Sefer Shirim, presents cosmopolitan European culture inside a Hebrew national form, the Thesaurus, Melodian Schatz, Otzar, offers an essentialist Hebrew national concept inside an explicitly European form. Put differently, the former represents an Oriental West, the latter a Westernized East. But it makes little sense to focus exclusively on this Hebrew Orientalism without seeing it in relation to Hebrew cosmopolitanism, these two different works. To appreciate what Idelsohn was trying to do with this concept of Hebrew music, we have to see how the two texts reverberate together and what their relationship is to one another, and what this means for Hebrew and Israeli music as a whole. So what does it mean? It's tempting, in the final analysis, to speak of the dualistic character of Idelsohn's Hebrew music, especially given the focus of my talk that there are these two iconic texts, and one is cosmopolitan and one is romantic essentialist nationalism or something of that sort. In this, we could follow the lead of one of Idelsohn's most famous students, the legendary composer